Good morning. I'm Stephen Bader, Executive Director of the East Bay Economic Development Alliance, or as we call ourselves, East Bay EDA. And we're really excited to have you here this morning for our event about the gig economy. And we're really have a timely topic, of course, because we all know that coming up in just a week or so, we'll all be, if we haven't already, be voting on a matter related to that. But today's topic is really looking beyond the gig economy. And while we will maybe touch on Prop 22, we're really not, that's not so much the focus of today's topic, as more about re-envisioning the ways in which gig work can come together. So I'm really excited to introduce our panelist for today, our speaker, Wingham Rowan, who's the director of Beyond Jobs. Wingham is a former technology journalist and was producer host of the UK's longest running TV series about the internet. And he's overseen multiple implementations of new flexible workforce or volunteering tools for many different companies and organizations. Wingham ran British government programs that turned out to be world leading in the way they conceived of bringing gig workers into public employment services and using a new kind of labor market to do that. He has spent the past 4 years working in various corners of the United States, working with workforce boards at state, county, and city levels, exploring ways to pilot similar efforts here in the US. And I know that's one thing he'll be talking about today. Wingham, we're excited to have you here and look forward to your presentation. As we get started too, folks who are here on the webinar, you're welcome to drop your questions in the chat so that we can have time to try to address those between now and our close at 11 a.m. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Very good to see everyone. Apologies for being a bit gloomy. It is actually dark in London, UK, where I am. I'm normally in Los Angeles at this time of year, but because of the pandemic, we're all living a strange life. So yeah, I'm very pleased that Stephen raised Proposition 22 and AB5. I know you're being bombarded with TV commercials about this at the moment. And the message of our work is AB5 and Proposition 22 and the 185 million that's being spent in this battle so far is a sideshow. There are much more profound issues for much bigger numbers of people who are working in this irregular, precarious way. And if you are going to address that, you really want the public workforce system and public agencies behind it. In fact, it's probably the only way to do it. And for once, this is an area where the British government took the lead. I managed those efforts. I am British, obviously, so apologies for the accent and for all that unpleasantness in 1776. But we systematically created a very different kind of marketplace for all types of low-skilled hourly labor. That has now been Americanized with 4 national philanthropies and Irvine Foundation funding. We are launched in SoCal. We could spread up to the Bay Area anytime you're ready for us. There is a bit of work involved in launching this thing. Nothing comes completely easily. But yes, this is about how you in the Bay Area could systematically raise standards for all sorts of people who are now scrabbling for whatever work they can get. So if that makes sense, I'm going to share my screen, if I may, and I'm hoping you're now seeing my slides. But this is about not thinking about the world of, I'm going to keep using the word gig work, the words gig work for now, but as you'll see, that they're not very helpful ultimately. But instead of thinking about it in a global way, so for instance, WAG for dog walking aims to be the global platform for dog walking. Think about it in a city way, because if I'm a dog walker in Oakland, I actually might want to progress into deliveries, carpet laying, roofing, interior painting, installing electricals. I want a horizontal market. I don't just want to be a dog walker. So it's rethink from that perspective. It's about thinking about the city or the region's economy and what people need within it. And if I may, very briefly, and I'll do this in little nuggets because we all know how irritating a British accent can be, but broadly, this is the issue that workforce boards and public agencies around the US are coming to see. What I'm showing on the screen now is the traditional view of the labour market. Bulk of the population in a steady job, handful of people unemployed, and a sort of negligible sliver of the population just doing odd bits of work. You know, the teenager who cuts your lawn, somebody who goes and clears the tables in a cafe when they've had a real rush. And what is happening, and what was well established before the pandemic, was that bits of work part of the labour market was growing at the expense of people who had absolutely no work and people who had sort of 9-to-5 traditional jobs. And in Britain, we set out to embrace this whole field holistically. And that's significant because this field has grown massively with the pandemic. I would argue bits of work is going to be vital for about 50% of workers in 2021. So we want to take the whole thing and tackle all the problems systematically, except there's one bit we took out, which is skilled at-home freelancing. If you're a web designer, a copywriter, translator, a lawyer, you can pull projects off sites like Upwork, do them in your own time, upload the work, get paid, and it's all under your control and everything's fine. That part of the labour market is working well, but there's a much, much bigger, more complex part of the labour market, which is the low skilled. And part of the problem we're going to have discussing this is there's an absolute data deficit about what's happening here. BLS data is just not keeping pace. And the second problem we have is that you in America have so many words for these people, and we're talking about all of them. So I'm going to use the term irregular employment, if I may. And by that, we mean anyone working outside the home with no contractual expectation of regular hours or pay. And so this is people who work in supermarkets, in hotels, in distribution centers, people who walk dogs, people who work in construction sites, in care homes, and so on. And the first way that I want to dissect this huge chunk of the workforce is how these people are connecting to their work. So we've learned that there's 3 broad cohorts. We all know about the gig work platforms, particularly if we're besieged by ads for Proposition 22. There are thousands of gig work platforms. They've got a lot of money, they make a lot of noise, and they're statistically pretty irrelevant in what's happening. Far bigger numbers of people are W-2 employees who are scheduled, called in and sent home either each week or each day according to their employer's needs. In a corporate, that'll be done by a workforce scheduling system. In a small business, it'll probably be done by a manager with a clipboard. And those people who haven't got the hours they need from their primary employer then have to find extra hours elsewhere. And then there's the shadow economy, which is often overlooked, but is a vast part of this irregular work. As formal labour market participation has gone down, shadow economy activity has gone up. The World Bank estimate the US shadow economy is 10% the size of GDP. That's probably grown since 2015. And it's overwhelmingly made up of people doing odd bits of work. And just to be clear, the shadow economy is not the criminal economy. The shadow economy describes activity that would be legal if it was taxed and regulated. So the second way that we learned to dissect this vast part of the labour market is why each of these people is working irregularly, rather than either having a 9-to-5 or not having any work at all. If you have a medical condition that comes and goes day to day, if you have complex parenting needs, if you're caregiving for a dependent adult, if you're studying on a low income, if you're trying to start your own home business, you might wake up this morning not knowing if you can work today. Can I work today? It depends if my back pain goes away. I'll decide after lunch. Can I work today? Depends if I can get both my parents into the Alzheimer's Day Centre. Depends if I have any clients for my home hairdressing business. If I have, I'll need hours of work that fit around that. And you might be surprised how many people want to work this way, particularly the young. I've sat in on focus groups where 20-somethings talk about having a job as a bit like having a fax machine. it's something that people did in the old days. Why would I do that? It's mono-skilled dependency on one organization. Of course, I want a portfolio of employment on my own terms. I want employers competing for me. I want the diversity of networks and learning and opportunities that would open up. And that screen is the store manager's view of Kronos Workforce Central 8 for retail. And the red bars are saying to the manager, you've got too many of a particular kind of worker in the store right now. Start sending them home. And Kronos is texting the ones who think they're coming in later to tell them they're not. And services like this can be astoundingly accurate. So if you're the store manager, you might set a rule that 22.7% of what goes through your checkouts any hour is to be spent on staffing. And Kronos will manage the skills mix to make that work as ideally as possible for you. It can crunch traffic data, weather data, promotional data. It can count the cars coming with the pilot. I mean, the data sources it can use to get to the optimal figure are staggering. And we don't know how this precision is being used. Occasionally there are exposés. Walmart was caught using Kronos in quite a brutal way and has subsequently backtracked and apologized. But that is what's creating these pools of not just partially employed people, but people who don't know if they're going to be partially employed this week. It works fantastically for the employers, but it casts all the risk and uncertainty onto breadwinners who still have to put food on the table each night. And there is this data deficit, but I want to emphasize how big this is. So if you were to say, in 2019, what percentage of each of these cohorts made up the Bay Area labor market? I could easily defend those figures based on completely independent research. I mean, it's big, it's really big, and it's not showing up in the way it should. And at this point, people will sometimes say, particularly people who buy the arguments around Proposition 22, will say, well, so why are we talking about this? What's this got to do with workforce boards and government agencies? There's obviously huge demand for this sort of work. There's a huge supply. Why are we bothered? And the way we like to answer that is to compare the plight of somebody seeking gig work or irregular employment out of choice or out of necessity with someone who is looking for a job. So you absolutely know about the misclassification issue that gig workers are classed typically as independent contractors when the courts now say they should be employees. You know that there's no benefits for the irregular workforce typically. You may not be aware just how difficult it is to progress in this world of work, because let's say that I live in Oakland and I want to do deliveries this morning to make some money. So do I go to DoorDash? Do I go to Uber Eats? Do I go to Postmates? Do I go to TaskRabbit? Grubhub? Where do I go? Each of these online markets has a small percentage of the people who might buy my labor this morning. And actually, I might not really aspire to do deliveries. I might really want to be a beautician, a bricklayer, a babysitter. I've got to be in even more markets to try and pursue that. And these markets make it extremely difficult for me to work in more than 2 or 3 of them at a time, because if I'm off doing a booking for Marketplace A when Marketplace B sends me a booking, the algorithms running Marketplace B will downgrade me. So it's like saying to a job seeker, you can only see openings from 3–4% of the employers that might hire you. There are all sorts of unpaid overheads around this sort of work, sorting out the bookings, working out how to fulfill them, the bookings that fail. It's equivalent, it's been calculated, to having to do about 20% extra unpaid hours in a job. In the job seekers world in America, certainly, you have staggeringly good LMI. You know what's happening. You know where the growth sectors are, what the average wages are. You can plot your path. In this world, you not only have a data deficit, you have actively misleading data being put out by the people who do own what data there is. And these marketplaces come and go. They fail with extraordinary rapidity. Thousands of Americans were cleaning houses through HomeJoy and woke up one morning and the investors had pulled the plug. They just decided they weren't going to get the returns they want. So for those people, that was their track record, their immediate flow of work, their buyer relationships, all gone overnight. They had to start again in the bottom of yet another forum and hope that one didn't go bust. But on the other hand, you don't want a market that becomes too successful, because then they've got critical mass and they can start slashing pay. Uber famously did it in 2016. That pretty much forced all the others to follow, because Uber took a leap in valuation shortly thereafter. And if that's making you feel good about using Lyft, they started it. It's the business model. It's not an aberration. It's not something they did in the bad old days. Their model is reliant on this behavior. And we're just beginning to learn what it's like to have an opaque algorithm as a boss. So if you go through a bad patch in a job, the manager will call you in, possibly put you on warning, possibly support you in approving. In this world, the algorithm controls your supply of work, and it is completely unaccountable and completely non-transparent. If your bookings just stop today, you have no knowledge it's going to happen. You don't know why it's happened, and it's not happening because of anything to do with developing you as an asset. It's happening because whatever the algorithm is doing, it's focused on generating profit or cutting wage costs, not on developing the workforce. So those are what we call the 8 problems that need to be addressed. And yes, Proposition 22 is fighting AB5. AB5 would tackle number 1 and go some way towards tackling number 2. Doesn't do anything about the rest. I mean, it might tackle number 4. I wouldn't underestimate the ingenuity of these companies in the way they can force risks off onto the workforce. So briefly, and then I will conclude this sort of digging into what the problem is, and it would be good to look at a solution. But there are, of course, attempts to roll this back. You know about the wage hikes, and you may not be aware of just how sophisticated these workforce scheduling tools are. So this is public knowledge. When Walmart adapted to $15 an hour or to a rise in minimum wage, their workforce scheduling tools just held that 22.7% of what's going through the checkouts, or whatever the figure is. Everybody works harder for less hours. You cannot beat these systems if you play by these kind of rules. You'll be familiar with Fair Scheduling Acts. I think San Francisco has one, LA floated one, Seattle started them. It says typically that big retailers must schedule their staff up to 4 weeks ahead. And this is creating a boom in what are called tap the app staffing companies. So Worktoday, Catapult, Forge, I mean, there's dozens of them. They come and go. But what they do is they'll call up the stores and say, you don't know how busy your shop is going to be 4 weeks from now. Why don't you just let your employees dwindle and start booking our temps who we just keep on call every day whenever you need them. Anyone you don't like, just tap the phone, you'll never see them again. We take all the liabilities, and some of them will algorithmically calculate the lowest wage they need to pay to populate your store today. And then, of course, there's AB5, Proposition 22. Let's not even go there. It's a sideshow. And that 90 million is now 185 million. Think of AB5 and Proposition 22, I suggest, not as some sort of end game in the fight for precarious workers' rights, but as a canary in the coal mine of what's to come if we keep going down these sort of solutions. Because what Proposition 22 has revealed is it's worth spending 185 million in one state to stop employment rights spreading. That's how profitable it is to run a for-profit labor market at the moment. And that is going to spread. So Uber and Lyft and other companies, in case we're not aware of it, build their customer base with subsidies. If Uber opens in a new city, up to 66% of the price of each ride can be subsidized. That gets them to critical mass very quickly, kills off the competition, and then their business model can kick in. And they're doing it fairly quiet. It's sort of on off. It's currently on hold. But Uber has got something called Uber Works, which is their attempt to run an all sectors labor market. It launched in Chicago last year, spread to Miami at the beginning of this year. It's on hold for the pandemic, but they stop and start these kind of internal business lines all the time. I would be really, really worried about Uber Works if I were running a workforce board anywhere in the US, because if they come in and start subsidizing to get all the demand into their market, they already have the algorithms, the business model, the aggression, the lack of ethics, everything they need to make an absolute killing off the back of this workforce. And that will create even bigger pools of commoditized, controlled, cheapened workers that will further undermine the business case for creating jobs for an awful lot of companies. So I should probably shut up there before you'll start wanting to sort of dump tea in the harbor or something. I just want to check that makes sense so far.
You're doing great, Wingham. Continue.
Okay, all right. I've just seen 53 participants. Fantastic. So I'll carry on if that's okay. So back to where we were. So yeah, the British government were actually the first to do something about this. It doesn't happen very often, but they actually took the lead. And I was engaged to run that initiative. And we started not with technology. We started in a very different place. We just sat down and came up with a list of what's every possible intervention you could have to support people in irregular work. And we came up with a list. I'm very happy to share it. There's something like 50 options in all sorts of different categories. But we wanted to get to the underlying issue. What's the absolute core issue? If you are to allow this workforce to progress, to get to stability, to maximize their income, to pursue their own individual pathways, but also to deliver quality and alignment with what the local economy needs, what's the underlying issue? And it is quality of marketplace. So if you're in a job, you typically enter the labor market every few years when it's time to move on. If you're in this world, you can be in and out of the labor market several times a day in search of your next assignment. And the way the markets you access are constructed, their breadth, their depth, whose interests they serve, the data they share with you, the facilities they give you, the percentage of your earnings they extract, that's what determines your life chances. And any marketplace for this kind of labor is going to be technology based. These are such complex transactions. And the more you try to bring this work into the legitimate economy and empower the workers, the exponentially more complex everything has to get under the hood. So armed with that, we just sat down and said, well, what does a really healthy hourly labor market look like in the 21st century? It's got to empower each worker. It's got to give them control. It's got to have employers competing for the people who prove their reliability. It's got to strip out overheads to attract activity out of the shadow economy. It's got to give away all its data. It's got to be ultra low overhead. It's got to be accountable under local management. And everything I've just described does not add up to a sizzling Silicon Valley investment opportunity. That's a public utility. And that begs the question, well, who's going to run and launch these kind of markets? And what's interesting is in the job seeker world, we already know the answer to that question. Every state workforce agency in the US commissions a job board that sits alongside Indeed.com and Monster.com. And it's just an alternative. If you want to use jobs.utah or Indiana Career Connect to find your next job, you're very welcome. If you want to use it alongside Monster, that's fine. These sites have no agenda beyond, as we know, economic growth, developing individual opportunities, data generation, and interfacing into public assistance programs. And of course, the granddaddy of them all is CalJobs. So imagine what I'm talking about as CalFlexi. Very different technology, much, much more complex market, but the same ethos. There is no agenda here beyond individual opportunity, economic growth, and getting everybody the workforce and the opportunities they need while interfacing into all sorts of interventions to support people who are struggling and capturing and publishing the data so anyone can use it. And when you start thinking like this, a really interesting model for online technologies comes into focus. And you will know this model from the last time you booked a vacation online in the days when anybody was booking vacations. But when the travel industry moved online, the airlines, the hotel chains, the rental car companies got together and created what they call the GDS, Global Distribution System. And it's their database of each of their assets, each hotel room, each flight seat, each rental car, when it is available and how it is to be priced to maximize their income. And when we go to one of the consumer sites, you will remember how they do the kind of twirling circle. We're just sorting out your booking. That's when they're talking to the GDS, because the GDS is such a deep, reliable database. You would be crazy to try and start a travel site without it. But it's working for the sellers. It's feeding all the data back to that side, but it's also driving reliability, because if I manage a Holiday Inn, I take any booking that comes through the GDS with extreme seriousness, because if my record in the GDS becomes unreliable, that's most of the market gone to me. So it gives us as buyers enormous flexibility. It lays the market bare. I want to go to Seattle tonight, and it just says, here's every flight seat, every hotel room, everything's priced, everything's reliable, a couple of clicks and it's done. It is a world apart from gig work markets that tell you who's going to do your job, or just say, put up an advert and see who comes back to you. And we asked, could you do the same for hourly labor? And you can. It's called a CEDA in California. It's branded CalFlexi. And broadly, it takes in the availability of each individual. It takes in hour by hour for up to 10 weeks. It knows what skills they have, what work they're willing to do, which fixed pay rates they've accepted, how to construct a pay rate based on their personal rules where there is no fixed pay rate they've agreed, and so on. And I could talk about it at length, which would be a real turnoff. Or if there's an appetite, I could show you 2 short videos of the LA CEDA in action. Is that okay?
Please do.
Okay, so I am just, forgive me, I'm just going to re-share my screen. I just have to do a slightly ugly player. So 2 little 5-minute videos. The first is the market working for workers. And apologies, there's yet more British accent on this. We couldn't find anyone who could speak properly to narrate it. Meet Yvonne. She lives in the north of Metro Los Angeles. Looking after a 2-year-old disabled grandson is a big part of her life. So are her positions in community groups. She's a veteran who would like a career in care. It's 10 a.m. on Sunday. A relative can take the grandson. She wants to work. Yvonne finds employment through a local non-profit, 90068 Work. They are one of the agencies acting as an intermediary on the area's CEDA. They vetted her and act as employer of record. Their markup is then built into the rate for each hour she works. This intermediary allows Yvonne to work for multiple clients on her own terms. She's become an experienced CEDA user, accessing it on her home computer or through the app on her phone. The platform now has rich data on her. It has much simpler interfaces for new users. To build her pathway through irregular work, the CEDA needed to know 3 things. The key to her progression is a screen of checks. Think of a check as any confirmed fact about Yvonne
that could help her get quality work. So she has credentials. They can range from a bachelor's degree to employer training certificates. Yvonne has some retail training from the past. Her credentials include a badge issued by local educators. Some of these credentials have expiry dates, and the Cedar will stop her doing any work requiring that credential unless it is renewed after that date. And of course, her credentials have been confirmed by staff at 90068 work. She also has tags. A tag is anything about her that might attract resources or be useful in tracking her outcomes. Yvonne lives in the 90068 area. She was incarcerated. That's confidential, but it attracts support, so she has chosen to tell the Cedar. That record will disappear in a few months. Finally, on this screen, the Cedar wants to know about her preferences. It knows, for example, she's happy to work outdoors and to wear an employer's uniform. These verifications add up to 34 unique data points about Yvonne. The Cedar is constantly helping her get more. Based on the verified data, she from one household, perhaps with a fixed pay rate attached. For example, a local secure facility looks for ex-military workers with an interest in care as top-up patrol guards. She's happy with the pay rate. She's done their induction. They are happy to book her whenever she's available. If there's no fixed rate, she can set her own for that type of work. And she can turn any role inactive at any time. She's been doing well with plenty of bookings and has turned off her old retail roles. But of course, she can return to that work anytime she wants. The Cedar is constantly working to get her more roles to choose from. Yvonne has worked for multiple organisations and individuals through the Cedar. She can set a personal rate against any of them. A housing company treated her poorly on a recent booking. She will only work for them again if she gets $30 an hour. She's in a wide market. She isn't reliant on them. 90068 work allow Yvonne to work for clients who have no fixed pay rate. She likes doing that. They also allow her to set the terms on which she will accept those bookings. That can factor in how far she would have to travel to a booking. She wants compensation the further she would have to go from home. Will she do short-length bookings? She will, but only for a higher hourly rate. How much notice does she need of a booking? Some work seekers don't have a smartphone or home computer. They only log in once a week in the library, so they need 7 days' notice of each piece of work. That's fine. But when Yvonne's available for work, she's happy to drop everything and do a booking. Only if there's extra money. The Cedar can, of course, impose all sorts of legal controls on her maximum hours, minimum breaks, and times of work. She has chosen to put her own ceiling on the hours she can be booked each week. And she can even price by day of the week. If she's available on a Sunday, she will only do general bookings for an extra $1.50 an hour. She knows clients often struggle to get good workers on weekends. Yvonne only occasionally visits the pages we've just looked at, but decisions about when she can work might change several times a day. She can have a pattern of availability that rolls on week after week unless she changes it. Sometimes her lifestyle is less predictable, so she can constantly change the time she is able to leave the home. She may be doing this hour by hour as things come up during her day. Her bookings on this screen are color-coded. If the label is dark green, that booking is part of an ongoing weekly arrangement. The Cedar is constantly incentivizing these first steps to an employer-employee relationship. She also has one-off bookings at times she's available later in the week. Yvonne has childcare and can work until 4:30 p.m. today. Later, she extends that on her phone. Yvonne's skills, terms, and hours are now in the local labour market for today. Hundreds of thousands of Angelinos could be in the Cedar with her. To see the process of booking workers and Yvonne getting an assignment, continue watching our videos.
So apologies, I think that was actually a bad early mix of one of the old demo videos. There is an equal length video for the buyers of labour. Should we skip over it? We can show it at the end if there's interest.
Sure.
Okay, so if I may, I'll go back to the screens and back to the slides. So that's the market in action. I mean, there's all sorts of things that come out of the back end that might not have been clear. Extraordinary levels of data like you haven't seen before. If you wanted to know how many people did window cleaning bookings on a Tuesday morning within 3 miles of Oakland City Hall, where the worker was under 26 and had previously been in the services, it will tell you. If you want to compare their earnings to classroom assistants working part-time in the eastern side of town, it will do that for you. So you gain huge pools of actionable data that can be used to plot interventions, find the strugglers who need help, align skills, and it shows you skills gaps ahead because it knows availability ahead. So if you want to know how many staff qualified to operate a store checkout are going to be available over the Christmas weekend, it will know with some reliability by end of November, depending on how far ahead your people are putting their availability in. So that's the CEDA technology. You could have it for the East Bay tomorrow. It's actually running on a server farm not far from you. It's serving the LA area. I'll get to that in a moment. But I just want to share the key challenge if you were to want to launch something like this in the East Bay. And it's to do with what we learned in Britain. The first thing we learned was just how contentious irregular work can be. So we were funded by multiple central government departments and 20 city governments, and Department of Work and Pensions, DWP, which is the British Ministry of Labour, opposed us. They really believed that government should only be involved in fostering traditional employment, and that situation persisted for many years. However, we were launched by 20 city governments, and Tesco, which is the British equivalent of Walmart, our biggest private sector employer, came in. Everybody was doing this at small scale. Tesco refused to join the city government markets. They just wanted a walled off market for Tesco staffers, in which Tesco was the only buyer, which isn't really what the system is set up to do. So we never got this kind of critical mass issue. We had a lot of small markets. And what happens in those circumstances, and we're a bit slow to realize it, if I'm honest, is this. So this is data from London Borough of Newham that I'm allowed to share. They are the poorest borough in London. They absolutely understood the problem. Lots and lots of people in Newham need work that fits around all sorts of other things in their complex lives. So they put the market in their website. They encouraged local intermediaries to feed people in. And then the first week, with very little publicity, they had 18,000 hours of residents' availability for work. They had 70 hours of demand from employers because nobody had thought to outreach to the demand side. The second week, they were up to about 150 hours of demand, but they were down to about 12,000 hours of availability. Because what happens is when you announce one of these markets, the supply side will move very, very fast. People desperately need a better model for this work. They will sign up in droves, but the employers will be much slower. The companies that use flexi labor, they have all sorts of worries. I mean, you know, these monopsony markets, these scheduling tools work very well at the moment. Why on earth would you come into a system that is going to empower the workers, expose them to other opportunities, encourage them to move onwards and upwards? So those two forces become remorseless, and their lines just collided. And within about 4 weeks, we were down to something like 1,000 hours of availability a week, about 800 hours of bookings. And the market then is too small. It's got no headroom to expand. So if a promotions company comes in and says, we want people to do leafleting at a metro station at lunchtime today, the market just says, well, I haven't got people who can do leafleting. I haven't got people near that metro station. and you just can't get out of that. You have to launch at scale, was what we we finally grasped. What you have to do is this. Forget about the supply side. It's completely counterintuitive, but you can take that for granted, particularly post-pandemic. What you have to do is what we call market making, and that is broadly a process of getting the big users of flexi labor in the area to sign up to adopt the new platform before it is launched. And we would say for the East Bay, don't even think about launching until you've got a minimum $10 million worth of expenditure on flexi labor to go through the market over its first 12 months. That will pull through a certain number of workers. It will give you enough depth and headroom and diversity in the market, and then it will reach critical mass and it can go organic from there. And in case that figure, $10 million minimum, sounds daunting, I would say that Oakland City Hall alone, based on what I know of the size, probably spends around $25 million a year on flexi labor in different budgets, different departments. It's no secret that City of Long Beach, which I think is roughly comparable in size, spends $4.5 million a year just over the 3 months of summer on parks and recreation workers, the people who clean the parks, staff the parks, run events in the parks, do outreach around the parks. So these numbers sound formidable, but there's an art to making the market, which I will touch on very quickly in a moment. So very briefly, and I do apologize again for the accent. What happened in Britain and what this learning all came together in this sequence of events was there was an election and the incoming administration did a complete 180 degree within the Ministry of Labour, and they went to the other extreme and announced that our platform, which was then called Slivs of Time Working, was going to be a cornerstone of the Universal Credit, which was their bold, exciting scheme to throw out the Byzantine British welfare regime and replace it with one streamlined credit. And part of that would be the proposition that some work is always better than none. If you couldn't get a job within the Universal Credit, you would go into our platform and you would be found the bits of work that would build you a track record that would fit around your job interviews or your family commitments or whatever. You can probably guess what happened to the Universal Credit. I think it's now, I forget, it's either 4 years behind schedule and 5 times over budget or the other way around. It is an absolute unmitigated disaster. We were shelved in about 2013, having piloted with them, integrated with them, and wound down these 20 city launches that were just running at small scale. Universal Credit was going to be the ticket to big scale because for all sorts of reasons in Britain, employers will use the Ministry of Labour schemes to get their large headcount workforces. So at that point, we looked around and realized no other country had done anything like this. And we put a copy of the technology in a non-profit for open sourcing, looked around. The British consulate said, if you want social impact, go and talk to the American workforce system. We were very fortunate. Aspen Institute, National Governors Association, NORB, National Association of State Workforce Agencies, USDOL, various other bodies promoted us to cities. And I'm very pleased to say that when Stephen was running the Oakland City Workforce Board, he was in this first wave. But Annie Casey Foundation enabled a body of work by 25 workforce bodies, and there they are around the country. And that made the case for the workforce system moving from a focus on traditional jobs to what we call full spectrum employment support. We want to meet the labor market where it is. We want to meet each customer where they are. If you just need bits of work to fit around your medical condition or you're looking after your kid, we're here for you then. And that's only viable with a platform. The challenge, as Stephen will know, is that the workforce system is funded by federal dollars, which are tied to 6 performance metrics, and they all relate to traditional 20th century employment. And changing those 6 performance metrics would be a huge prize. Absent that, the 7 workforce boards that make up Los Angeles County wrote an open letter to philanthropy saying, we can't fund this, but we'd like to go first in the nation. I think in all honesty, that was partly driven by a theory that the Bay Area would go first if LA didn't. And Kaufman Foundation, Walmart Foundation, and Wells Fargo Foundation came forward and enabled Americanization of technology, a pilot launch program. That then won the US Conference of Mayors Award for the best job or economic development initiative in America. And out of all that came a manual on how to do this market making. And we had 40 workforce boards that were involved in that. And again, excuse me, Oakland was in there as well. So that manual would be exactly what we would recommend for anybody trying to start this kind of market in the East Bay. And I think you'll find it is about reaching out to the big users of flexi labor and building a business case for why a market that empowers the workers is better for them. It reduces churn, it increases retention, drives up quality, gives you all sorts of actionable data. And public agencies are very good place to start in that search. But we break it down, which sectors to go for, what size, and so on. And then in LA County, all sorts of public bodies got behind it, the regional centers and so on. And we were due to launch in March this year with we had about $20 million worth of wages in the Long Beach area, built around hospitality, events, some care, but the anchor customer was the Long Beach Convention Center, which flexes its workforce requirements constantly as events come and go. And the hotels in Long Beach flex around it. So you have this constantly ebbing and flowing need for labor in the hospitality sector. That all collapsed, of course, in March. The mayor pivoted and refocused us on childcare, which was really interesting because at this point, well, the announcement was made the weekend that the schools shut in LA County, because suddenly a lot of supply teachers and youth workers lost their regular hours, just as countless families discovered they had to look after the kids. And congregant childcare wasn't going to work. Very few families can afford a full-time nanny. So this is about recognizing each family is going to maximize informal care, relatives and friends, but there are going to be gaps, times when both husband and wife have to be on shift out of the home, for instance. They need flexible hour-by-hour childcare. They need one worker that they know and trust, and that person has to be COVID prepared and so on. So with our partner, nonprofit partner, Skills for Care, the Long Beach Workforce Board, Pacific Gateway, launched that. And I'm very pleased to say that as of Monday, 2nd of November, CARES Act money will be flowing through this market. So until now, it's been a tool for, frankly, the middle class that can afford their own childcare. It's very reasonable rates. It's something like $22 an hour for a fully trained, re-vetted, COVID-ready childcare professional. But you can get it free if you're a low-income family from Monday through to the end of the year. And that is it's maximizing the resource. So if you use the available budget to give families a full-time nanny, you would cater for something like 40 families. By giving each family an initial 40 hours to book as and when they need, and then renewing that in light of their needs, you cover, I think the latest figure is something like 160 families instantly. And that's for an initial $85,000. And you'll be familiar with the SWIFI initiative, Support for Working Families initiative. That also has a childcare component, and that is heading for the market in Long Beach. And as Stephen knows, there is also work going on around potential expansion throughout LA County. There's a lot going on behind the scenes on that, but feel free to ask Stephen off the record if you want an insight into that. So this thing is up and running. You could have it tomorrow. You would need someone to do the market making. It's not that arduous. It's low risk. We would say do not launch until you've hit that minimum $10 million figure. So until that point, your only risk has been convenings and conversations and the time of whatever sort of business project manager you need to do it. And if there's anything we can do to help you with that, as Stephen knows, we're absolutely delighted to do so. And now I really will shut up before. before everyone begins
Thank
to
you for
realize
that.
why the Second Amendment seemed like such a good idea at the time.
Thank you for that great overview, Wingham. As you know, there's a couple questions that have come in through the chat and elsewhere, but I just want to start just in general, more about from a bigger macro perspective. How does an industry protect its workers, with regulations and things about, especially benefits, and then also remain flexible? So we have questions in here too about pension and healthcare benefits, how to ensure the supports that workers expect and need to be able to survive.
It can all be prorated. So if you're paying $18.50 an hour for me, and I'm getting $15, that's $3.50 goes on my benefits, tax, the intermediaries markup, and so on. So that's where it goes. And the system does this huge data output whenever each intermediary wants it, where it breaks all that down. And you may only be getting a few cents assigned to a sort of sickness benefit fund for that person, but it does it all, and every last cent is accountable.
And say a little more just about the role of that intermediary, because we had a question as well about advancement in training, and how does that also apply here, and how is it different from what we see in other markets, as you alluded to earlier, where people work across different platforms and don't get that sense of they have to kind of keep their rating, but they don't get necessarily to progress on those platforms.
You can't enter a CEDA market with just on your own. You can register, and then the system says, thanks very much for registering. You now need to be approved by an intermediary. So think of the CEDA as an underlying tool in the way we touched on the global distribution system used by the travel industry. You may never have been aware of the GDS. You don't need to know about it. You have an account at Expedia or Booking.com or Travelocity, and it's the same here. So your intermediaries could be commercial staffing agencies, non-profits, it could be the workforce board itself, and they can all partner with each other in all sorts of ways, and it manages all that and their individual business arrangements with each other. But what that means is that when I want to work this way, so let's say I do want to work very flexibly in Oakland this morning, I have to join through an intermediary, and they have to approve me into the system. So if I say I've got a truck driving certificate, they need to see it. They need to tell the system the date it ends, and it will make sure I don't do any truck driving bookings after that date unless it's renewed. And they are taking that responsibility, and they are building a markup into each hour I earn, say, typically sort of 5–10% for the service. But they're then motivated to keep me improving my earnings. So they can offer me new roles, they can apply new checks, they've got all the data they need that says, over the Easter weekend, we are going to be short of landscaping staff. Well, who have we got who's reliable and very close to landscaping, just needs half a day's training to do landscaping bookings? So that's the role they fulfill. They are the employer of record legally. They are whatever entities are approved by the workforce board or the public agencies. So in Long Beach, the first is Skills for Care. It's no secret there's also a plan for the workforce board itself to become an employer of record in this context. And they are the people you interact with. The CEDA, CalFlexi, is just the box in the basement in the way the GDS is. It's running everything. But the intermediaries make the decisions. It brands itself for each intermediary. It adopts their terminology, their rules, and they are completely in charge of what I, as a work seeker, am allowed to do, the terms on which I'm entered into the market, and so on.
And what would you say to folks who think maybe, is this kind of reinforcing or growing, perpetuating the same kind of devalued, underskilled, low wage labor?
Yeah.
What's your response to that?
Well, I hear this a lot. So it's very difficult to kind of nail this in one pithy quote, but let me have a go. Has CalJobs undermined the value of job seekers by being an alternative to Indeed.com and Monster.com? I humbly submit it hasn't. I suggest that whether we like it or not, irregular work, gig work, is now part of reality. And I absolutely understand a lot of people don't like it. They find it distasteful. They would rather it went away. And I would ask those people to think of irregular work as analogous to an illness. You know, we all agree that COVID is horrible. So we do two things. We try and find a cure, and we do what we can for the people who have got it. And having a CEDA is doing what you can for the people who are looking for gig work right now. It doesn't in any way stop you trying to bring in fair scheduling acts, create more jobs and everything else. But if your worry is that this will take you down a road to having people thinking about, well, how can I erode jobs? How can I make the labor market ever more uncertain and flexible? Your worst nightmares are already true. Some very bright, very well-resourced people in Silicon Valley are waking up this morning thinking, and they won't express it like this, but they're thinking, how can I break down jobs into more and more fragmented forms of work that I can take a cut on? And how can I algorithmically attract buyers and cut their costs, which means cutting wages, in all sorts of ingenious ways that haven't been thought of yet? If that's your dystopian nightmare, it's here. Having an accountable system within the public workforce boards that is dedicated to progression and options and empowerment does not lead to the scenario that I think is worrying people. You know, it begins to give power back to the workers.
So thank you for that great answer. And something else that folks have been asking about, and I know you have a fair amount of knowledge around, but thinking about universal basic income, or UBI, what are your thoughts about that as a way of being able to address unemployment and underemployment in the U.S. and in California in particular?
I'm all for UBI. I don't think anyone has a monopoly on great ideas to tackle social problems. There are so many social problems in the developed world at the moment, and they all need to be tackled. However, and I would say if you're going to have UBI, a CEDA can be a very good way of distributing it. But a CEDA also allows other more nuanced models. So you will know that people on the right, of course, criticize UBI, saying it's hugely expensive in terms of the taxpayer. It gives money indiscriminately to billionaires as it does to people on the poverty line. Then that may or may not be a valid argument. But if you wanted to counter it, you could think of the way something like the CEDA can very easily administer what we call guaranteed work. So suppose, for the sake of argument, City of Oakland said, any citizen who wants up to 20 hours of minimum wage work a week for up to 12 weeks, I'm just plucking examples out of thin air, can have it. The City of Oakland ring fences a fund to upgrade the parks, clean public spaces, and so on. You know, it's not brilliant, high quality work. It's just a way of getting survival money if you need it. But crucially, once you're doing it in the CEDA, it's beginning to understand your potential. It's beginning to track your reliability. So you do 3 weeks of guaranteed work, and you might have proved your reliability in 5 different locations with different types of work. And then it begins looking at, well, what could I skill you up for? Oh, there is a shortage of distribution depot workers in Oakland at the moment. Well, you, Wingham, have already proved that you are capable of lifting stuff, working outdoors, that you turn up when you say you will, all your timesheets get signed. It's well worth the workforce board, a philanthropy, even potentially the company that uses this labor, investing in training you to do that distribution depot loading. So, and that then becomes the next rung on the ladder. So guaranteed work is a way of it's the kind of suck onto the ladder. It's the absolute bottom, but that money will only ever go to people who need it, because billionaires don't go and do minimum wage work. So it's one more tool in the kit. It's not a silver bullet solution, but that's the kind of nuance you could do. And that would mean that all the funds earmarked for this kind of support goes exactly to the people who really need it, rather than going throughout the community.
Great. So we got about 60 seconds left, and of course, want to end back on a question that you talked about briefly. But how would you anticipate pilots like Cal Flexi being affected based upon what may happen with Prop 22?
Well, we spent a lot of time speculating on that. Very briefly, if Prop 22 passes, I think it will finally alert everyone indisputably to the way this workforce is being exploited, and companies are getting very rich on the back of it. And that really should drive the case for a public option, for the workforce system saying we have got to create an alternative like we do all the time in job markets. If AB5 prevails, which we obviously hope for, well, these companies are going to have, they're saying they will outsource their labor requirements. So they will have an intermediary, which will probably be one of these high volume staffing agencies. But what about it being the workforce boards? What about a model where Uber, if I'm in the Cedar in Long Beach, I can say, all right, I'm willing to be an Uber driver, but I've got 30 other types of work I can do. And if they pay me more, then I'm turning Uber off. And the workforce board or their intermediary becomes the employer of record. So that solves Uber's problem, immediate problem, but Uber will have to accept there's upwards pressure on wages. They haven't got all these people hanging around waiting like they do now.
Well, we're definitely waiting, and on that note, waiting to see what happens next week. But thank you very much for this fantastic overview. We hope all of you have enjoyed today's presentation, and look forward to seeing you again next time in our next webinar.
And
Thank
anyone
you
who
all so
wants,
much.
so
We'll be in touch. Thank you, Wingham.
thanks. Bye.